Hello guys, and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So in this video we are going to be continuing with our food delivery application. So now we are going to be getting data from our Firebase categories from our Firebase, right? So the first thing that you need to do is let's go inside our Firebase storage, right? So inside our Firebase storage, I'm just going to create a folder I'm just going to create a folder that I'm going to name categories. So inside this folder, I'm just going to upload all the categories that are in our upload all the categories that are inside our that we were using the last time, which we put inside our assets folder. But now I want to upload them inside our Firebase storage, right? So let me just look for them. So these are our categories. Okay, so now that we are done, now the next thing that we need to do is let's check our models folder inside our, if we go inside categories, right, if we go inside our features folder, categories, models, we have the image and then the name, right? Image and then the name and then the category ID. Okay, so basically what I'm just going to do now is, what you need to do is if you click on this image, the beggar.png, you go to file allocation, you just copy this access token here. You can see if I open it inside the browser, it will lead me to this image, right? So let's just copy this access token. Let's go inside our Firebase database, right? Cloud Firestore, right? So now we need a new collection. So our collection name is going to be categories, right? It's going to be called categories. Now we need a document ID. So the document ID, let's make sure that the document ID is auto. And then let's paste for the image, then let's paste in our access token. And then for the name, let's just call it beggars. And then for the category ID, let's just give it a category ID of 1, right? Okay, so it will create a collection for us called categories. So you need to know that Firebase is a NoSQL database, right? So it stores our data using collections and then records or documents. So we have a collection. So a collection can be a group of documents, right? In this case, this document contains our beggar, which is of category 1, right? But this document belongs to this collection, which you called categories, right? So that's basically how it works. It's more of like, in a library we have like a collection of books, but a book, let's say, it's just like a collection of documents, right? Something like that, right? So now let's go back to our Cloud Firestore, and then I'm just going to do the same thing for this chicken. Copy the access token, and then I'm just going to go back to our Cloud Firestore, right? And then for the ID, just make sure that it's auto ID, right? So let me just paste in this image, and then the name is going to be chicken. And then the category ID is going to be 2. Okay, so what I'm just basically going to do is I'm just going to do this for all the images, and then I'm just going to continue this video after I'm done with. Okay, so I'm back. I'm done like populating the data inside our Cloud Firestore. So as you can see, we now have like our data here. We have name, image, and then the category ID. You can see we have like we have 7 categories, right? With different category IDs, right? Okay, so now that we are done, let's jump back into Visual Studio Code and let's start working on displaying these categories on our mobile app, right? So what I'm just going to do here is I'm just going to run the emulator, and then inside our let's go inside to our utils folder inside Firebase constants, right? Static let's create another constant for the categories collection, right? So this collection is going to be called, going to name it categories, right? It must be similar to our Cloud Firestore collection. Otherwise, if it's different, you are just going to get an error, right? So let's just close this, and then now we can basically go inside our features folder under categories. Inside our repository, let's create the category repository. So let's create a class which are going to name our category repository, right? So this class, what this class is going to check, it's going to have Firebase Firestore, because we are getting data from Firestore, right? Firebase Firestore, and then Firebase Firestore, right? And then the next is we are just going to make sure that this instance here, we are just going to bind it inside the constructor, right? Inside our categories constructor. So let's create another variable, another instance of Firebase Firestore, and then Firebase Firestore, and then let's make sure that it's go to our Firebase. Okay, let's make sure that underscore Firebase Firestore is equals to Firestore, right? Firebase Firestore, like this, right? So the next thing that we are going to do is we are going to create a collection reference, right? A collection reference. This collection reference is going to be a get method, right? It's going to get the data from categories, right? And then let's make sure that this collection reference is going to reference to our categories, right? So in this case, our categories is coming from Firebase constants. It's coming from our class Firebase constant that we created in our utils folder dot categories collection, right? So this collection reference is just references our collection that we created inside our Cloud Firestore, right? So that's basically what this collection reference is, right? So now I'm just going to create a method, a stream, which is going to be a list of categories, since we are getting a list of categories from Cloud Firestore. So list of categories, which is coming from our categories model, right? List of categories, and then the function, I'm just going to name the function get categories. Right, so basically what this function is going to do is going to just return categories, right? It's just basically going to return categories dot snapshot, right? So snapshot our data from snapshot, and then we are just going to map the documents inside our collection, right? So I'm just going to call it event, right? So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a list of categories, because I want to store these categories inside the list, right? So it's going to be a list of categories. So category model, from the category model, categories, which is going to be an empty list, right? So now what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create a for loop, right? So I'm just going to say, for the variable, I'm just going to create this variable here, the doc variable, which is going to store like each and every document, right, inside the event.docs, right? So now what I'm just going to do with that, I'm just going to add each and every document inside inside our categories list, right? So this is coming from category dot from JSON, right? So the JSON data is going to be a document dot data, right? And then we want to make sure that this data is in the formats of map, type, string, right? And then dynamic, like this, right? So let's just put a semicolon there, and then let's just put another semicolon here. So basically, what is this method doing, right? So return categories. There must be an error. The bottom is gone null. Okay, so after this we need to return the categories, right? We need to return the categories. Okay, now the error is gone. So basically what this function is doing is just getting categories from our Cloud Firestore. So we're just going to get this a snapshot. So a snapshot represents our data inside our collection. Then what those data inside our collection, what we want to do is we want to loop through each and every document, right? We want to loop through each and every document, and then we create this empty list that we are going to store the data from our collection, right? Where we are going to store our documents, right? And then we create this variable document which is going to store every document in event.docs, right? So event.docs is just gives us what get all the list of documents in the snapshot, right? And then after that we are just going to add each and every document inside our category model, right, from JSON. Since this data that we're getting from Firebase is coming in as a JSON, right? The data is in the format of doc.data, right, as map. So we want it to be in the format of a map, a string, and a dynamic, right? So this dynamic, we use dynamic when we don't know the data type of the data, right? So what Firebase does is inside our document, as you can see, let me just pull out my Google Chrome and let me show you. So what Firebase does is each and every document is stored in the format of, as you can see inside, let's go inside our categories here. You can see that each field inside our document is stored as a string. We have here it's a string, and then we have a data type. In this case our data type is a string. But what if you don't know this data type? That's why you see we have, like, in our code base, right, we have to put in what inside our, when mapping our data, a string and a dynamic, because we know that the first the key on our field is a string, and then the other data type might be a string, might be boolean, so that we just put dynamic to be safe, so that if it's in another data type, dynamic can easily handle that. Okay, so now we are done with the category repository, right? So now let's move on to our controller, right? So let's move on to our controller. So let me just remove this Google Chrome from my screen here, and then let's move to our controller. But before we do that, we need to take care of, make sure that this category repository is accessible inside our controller, right? So to do that, we just use riverpod, right? We just create a category repository provider, right? Category repository provider, right? Which is going to be a provider and then a reference, and then I want this reference to point out to the category repository, right? So let's point it out to the category repository. So let's make sure that here we just import Flutter riverpod, right? Flutter riverpod, okay? So now we need this Firestore instance, right? So how do we do that? We just use reference.watch Firestore Firebase provider, right? We created this in the previous video when we worked on the authentication part. If you have not watched the authentication video, just go backwards and then watch it. You understand where it came from, right? So now let's move on into our controller. So I'm just going to create a file called category controller.dat, right? What I'm just going to do is we are just going to create a class called category controller, which is going to extend the async notifier from riverpod, right? Async notifier. Let's make sure that it extends async notifier. From the async notifier, we want it to come from an async value, right? An async value of type void, right? Of type void, like this, right? So here it's supposed to be async notifier, right? So let's import Flutter riverpod, and then what are we going to do next, right? So let's create a variable for the category repository. Let's create a category repository instance. So underscore, it's going to be category repository, like this, right? Let's put a semicolon there. So let's create an async value, right? So now the difference between the state notifier and the async notifier is that in the state notifier we would create like the category controller constructor, but in this case we don't. We just have to create a build function, right? So you just create a build function, and then what determines like this value here is going to be this value, right? So if you put, let's say, another class, let's say if it was going to be category state, here it's going to be category state and then a build function, right? So here that's where we initialize like our providers, right? So in this case, since we are working with category repository, right? So I'm just going to assign this category. How do we assign this how do we get this category repository? So we are just going to get it by referencing it from our provider that we created in the previous, in our category repository, right? So it's going to be category repository provider, like this, right? So that's how we initialize like our category repository instance, right? And then here we need to return a constant async value.data, and then the data, we just make sure that it's going to be null. It's going to be null, right? Let's put a semicolon right here. So now what we are going to do is we need a stream provider. We need a stream which is going to be a list of categories, right? So it's going to be a list of category model, right? So we are going to give it the same name as the one that we gave it inside the categories repository, right? So basically what this method is just going to do is just going to return the category repository dot get categories, right? So what this controller does is that it acts as a mediator between our user interface and the category repository, right? So the controller communicates with the repository to get data, and then it feeds it to the UI. and then the UI will then react according to the state changes, right? So now what are we going to do? So now that we are done, how do we make this controller accessible inside our UI? So what we are just going to do is we are going to create a categories controller provider. This categories controller provider is going to come from async notifier provider. Async notifier provider, which is going to take in the category. The category controller is the first parameter, and then our async value, which was of type void. And then it must just return a category controller dot new. Once we've done this, now we are done, right? Now we are done. Now, how are we going to make this stream provider accessible inside our user interface, right? So to do that, we need to create a stream provider, right? Stream provider riverpod. So I'm just going to find our get get categories. Get categories provider is equal to stream going to be equal to stream provider and then reference, and then we just make sure that is just going to reference our reference.read, because we want to read the categories controller provider dot notifier, and then we just want to get categories, right? So that's how we make it accessible inside our user interface, right? So now that we are done with this part, let's move inside our widgets, right? So inside our widgets, we have the category widget, right? So here what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to create a variable called final categories. And then before we do that, let's make sure that we change this from stateless widget to consumer widget. So let's import Flutter riverpod. So basically the consumer widget allows us to consume riverpod providers inside our user interface. And then we just pass in the widget reference inside our build function, right? So now we are just going to use this reference to access our stream provider that we created, which is get categories provider, right? Like this. Okay, so now what I'm just going to do is let's just copy this item right here. Let's just cut it, and then we are just going to return categories dot when. That's the good part about riverpod. We have the when, right? And then when you get our data, let's just pass in the data variable here, and then we'll just return and then let me just paste in this piece of code right there. And then let's say we got an error from Firebase, error, and then it's going to take an error and let's take trace as parameter, right? And then we're just going to return our error text, if you still remember from back then, for when we created our auth, right? So if you didn't watch the video, make sure you watch the video so that you understand where is this coming from. We created it from our authentication video. And then in case of loading, we just want to show like a loader, which is going to be a circular progress indicator. Loader. Okay, let's make sure this is going to be constant, right? Let's repeat with the constant widget, right? So here what we need to change a few things. We need to change this from to data.length. Data.length, and then for our category, right, we just need to provide data and then index, right? It's going to map with our index, right? So let's check on our emulator if our data is coming from Cloud Firestore. So let's refresh. So I think there might be an error somewhere. Let's check. So it's saying that categories collection, member categories collection not found. Let's go and check. Yeah, Firebase. Okay, so it's supposed to be capital letter C. Let's go inside our, yeah, it is categories collection. So let's copy this inside our, let's just paste it here. Let's try to run our application. Okay, so let me stop the emulator and then let me run it again. Okay, so now we are getting an error. I think I know what's going on. So let's go inside our category. Yeah, and then let's change this to cached network image, right? And then we need, it's supposed to be image URL, and then let me paste this. Then let me refresh the application again. Let's see. Yeah, now you can see we have now our data that is coming from Cloud Firestore, right? Which is okay. Now we completed like our first step of getting data from our Cloud Firestore. So in the next video, we are going to be getting like this banner from Cloud Firestore, and then we'll work on the getting menus from Cloud Firestore and the menu details. Thanks for watching, guys. Cheers.